The morning of June 6, 1944, before the sun had fully risen over the cold waters of the English Channel, thousands of young American men sat silently inside landing craft, gripping their rifles, clutching photographs of loved ones, and staring into the unknown. Many of them were barely out of high school. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Michigan, students from New York, and sons from every corner of the United States. Ahead of them waited the most heavily fortified coastline on Earth, defended by Nazi Germany's Atlantic Wall. Behind them was the greatest industrial and military power the world had ever seen, placing its faith not in machines alone, but in the courage of ordinary Americans. This moment would come to be known as D-Day, and it would define not only the outcome of World War II, but the meaning of American resolve itself. For months, Nazi Germany had believed Western Europe was secure. Adolf Hitler was convinced that any Allied invasion would fail, crushed beneath concrete bunkers, minefields, barbed wire, and thousands of machine guns aimed directly at the sea. The German High Command knew an invasion was coming, but they did not know when or where. Thanks to one of the greatest deception campaigns in military history, the Allies convinced Germany that the main attack would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, false radio transmissions, and even double agents fed false information straight into German intelligence. While the Nazis waited in the wrong place, the real invasion force gathered in silence. By the spring of 1944, the United States had transformed itself into an unstoppable war machine. American factories were producing ships, aircraft, tanks, trucks, weapons, and ammunition at a scale the world had never witnessed. Entire cities worked day and night, fueled by a belief that freedom itself depended on victory. This overwhelming industrial power allowed the Allies to plan an invasion so massive that it defied imagination. More than 156,000 Allied troops would land in France in a single day. Of those, over 73,000 were American. They would arrive by sea and sky, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft, forming the largest amphibious invasion in human history. In the early hours before dawn, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions boarded their aircraft. Their mission was terrifyingly simple and impossibly dangerous. Jump behind enemy lines in complete darkness, seize bridges, destroy German artillery positions, and block enemy reinforcements from reaching the beaches. As their planes crossed into occupied France, they were met by intense anti-aircraft fire. The night sky exploded with flak, tracer rounds slicing through the darkness. Many planes were hit. Some paratroopers were killed before they even jumped. Others landed miles away from their intended drop zones, scattered across fields, swamps, and hedgerows. Yet, despite chaos and confusion, small groups of American soldiers regrouped and fought on, attacking German positions with whatever men and weapons they could find. As dawn approached, the focus shifted to the beaches. 5 landing zones stretched along the Normandy coast. 2 would be assaulted by American forces, Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. Utah Beach, though still dangerous, saw lighter resistance than expected, but Omaha Beach would become synonymous with sacrifice. There, towering cliffs overlooked narrow strips of sand. German bunkers were carved into the rock, armed with machine guns, artillery, and mortars. Every approach was covered. Every inch of beach was pre-sighted for death. When the first wave of American soldiers approached Omaha Beach, the sea was rough, the sky gray, and visibility poor. Many landing craft drifted off course. Some struck underwater obstacles and exploded. Others dropped their ramps directly into murderous fire. The moment the doors opened, men were cut down in seconds. Heavy packs dragged soldiers underwater. Medics were killed as they tried to save the wounded. Entire units were pinned down, unable to move forward or retreat. For a time, it seemed possible that the invasion might fail right there, in the surf and blood of Omaha Beach. German defenders believed they were winning. From their bunkers, they watched American bodies fall and assumed no force could survive such punishment. What they did not understand was the mindset of the men coming ashore. These Americans were not trained to retreat. With officers dead and plans shattered, small groups of soldiers made decisions on their own. They crawled, ran, and climbed under relentless fire. Using grenades, rifle fire, and sheer willpower, they assaulted German strongpoints one by one. Slowly, painfully, the impossible began to happen. The Atlantic Wall was being breached by men who refused to quit. A fragile foothold on Omaha Beach. The cost was staggering. Thousands lay dead or wounded, but the beach was not lost. Against everything the Nazis believed possible, the Americans were inland. The German command, shocked and confused, struggled to respond. Hitler himself hesitated to release armored reserves, still convinced the real invasion might come elsewhere. That delay would prove fatal to the Third Reich. By the end of D-Day, more than 2,500 Americans were dead. Thousands more were wounded. Yet Normandy was secured. A gateway into Nazi-occupied Europe had been forced open by American blood and determination. What followed would be months of brutal combat, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany had lost the war the moment American boots stood firm on French soil. And this was only the beginning. As the smoke began to clear over the beaches of Normandy, the true shock of D-Day settled in on the German defenders. What they had been told was impossible had happened. American soldiers had not only survived the landing, they had broken through. Reports flooded German headquarters describing scattered units of Americans appearing behind lines, attacking from unexpected directions, and advancing despite catastrophic losses. Many German officers were stunned by the sheer determination of the troops they faced. These were not reckless assaults, but disciplined, relentless advances carried out by men who adapted instantly when plans collapsed. The myth of German defensive superiority was cracking, and it was cracking because of American soldiers who refused to accept defeat. In the days following the landings, the battle shifted from open beaches to the nightmare terrain of the Norman countryside. The hedgerows of France formed natural fortresses, dense earthen walls topped with thick vegetation that favored defenders. German troops, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, believed this terrain would allow them to halt the Allied advance. But once again, American ingenuity turned the tide. Tank crews welded steel blades onto their Shermans to cut through the hedgerows. Infantry units developed new tactics, coordinating closely with armor and artillery. Every field became a battlefield, every farmhouse a potential strong point. Progress was slow and costly, but it never stopped. German soldiers began to write home about the Americans with a mix of disbelief and fear. They described enemies who kept coming no matter how heavy the fire, soldiers who advanced under artillery barrages, who regrouped after losing leaders, and who seemed to possess endless supplies of men and equipment. American air superiority was overwhelming. Every road, bridge, and rail line was vulnerable to Allied aircraft. German reinforcements struggled to reach the front while American convoys moved freely. To many German troops, it felt as if the entire sky belonged to the United States. Behind the front lines, American logistics demonstrated a level of organization the world had never seen. Temporary harbors known as mulberries were constructed off the coast, allowing massive amounts of supplies to be unloaded directly onto the beaches. Fuel pipelines were laid beneath the sea. Trucks, weapons, food, and ammunition flowed continuously. Where German units rationed bullets and fuel, American forces fought with abundance. This industrial strength, combined with battlefield courage, created a force that Germany simply could not match. For civilians in occupied France, the arrival of American troops was nothing short of miraculous. Villages that had lived under Nazi rule for years watched as young men in unfamiliar uniforms pushed through hedgerows and streets, offering food, chocolate, and reassurance. American soldiers were greeted not as conquerors, but as liberators. For the German occupation forces, this was deeply demoralizing. The propaganda image of the Third Reich as Europe's unstoppable master collapsed as civilians openly welcomed the advancing Americans. As the weeks passed, the scale of the disaster became clear to German command. Normandy was no diversion. It was the beginning of the end. German divisions were being ground down, replaced by units with little training and even less morale. Meanwhile, American forces grew stronger every day. Fresh troops arrived continuously. Wounded soldiers were evacuated and treated with a medical system unmatched by any other nation. The United States could afford losses that Germany could not replace. What terrified German officers most was not just American numbers, but American confidence. Prisoners of war often reported being shocked by the calm determination of U.S. troops. Even after brutal fighting, American soldiers believed victory was inevitable. They spoke openly of pushing all the way to Berlin. To German ears raised on years of propaganda, this certainty was unsettling. It suggested that the Americans were not fighting to survive, but to finish the war completely. By late summer of 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy shattered German defenses in France. Entire German armies were encircled or destroyed. Paris was liberated. The Western Front, which Hitler had hoped to hold indefinitely, collapsed in a matter of months. The invasion that Nazi planners once mocked as impossible had become the decisive blow of the war in the West, driven by American leadership, American industry, and American courage. Yet perhaps the most powerful legacy of D-Day was not just territorial gains or strategic victories, but the message it sent to the world. It proved that free men, fighting for something greater than conquest, could overcome even the most brutal and fortified enemy. The beaches of Normandy became sacred ground, soaked with the blood of Americans who gave everything so that others could live free. And even today, long after the guns have fallen silent, the echoes of D-Day remain. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into France, stories began to emerge that would later define the American experience of D-Day and its aftermath. These were not stories of flawless victories or easy triumphs, but of ordinary men facing extraordinary terror and choosing to move forward anyway. Young Americans, many of whom had never left their hometowns before the war, found themselves leading assaults, making split-second decisions, and carrying the weight of entire units on their shoulders. In letters home, soldiers rarely spoke of heroism. Instead, they wrote about fear, exhaustion, and the determination not to let their brothers die in vain. This quiet resolve became the true strength of the American Army. German veterans would later admit that what disturbed them most was how American units recovered from chaos. When German defenses inflicted heavy casualties, they expected the attackers to collapse or retreat. Instead, American forces adapted. New leaders stepped up instantly. Units reorganized under fire. Attacks resumed even after catastrophic losses. To German officers trained in rigid command structures, this flexibility was alarming. It suggested an enemy that could not be broken simply by killing its commanders or disrupting its plans. Captured German soldiers were often astonished by the treatment they received. Many had been told by Nazi propaganda that Americans were brutal and uncivilized. Instead, they found themselves fed, given medical care, and questioned calmly. Some prisoners later recalled that this humane treatment deeply shook their beliefs in Nazi ideology. For the first time, they confronted the reality that the enemy they had been taught to hate was not a monster, but a professional soldier fighting for a cause larger than himself. As autumn approached, American forces continued their relentless advance. Town after town fell, bridges were seized, and German lines were forced back toward the Reich itself. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, would temporarily slow the Allies, but it could not change the outcome. By then, American strength was overwhelming. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and manpower flowed endlessly across Europe. German commanders knew the truth, even if they could not say it openly. The war was lost. For many Germans, D-Day marked the moment when defeat became inevitable. The Eastern Front had already drained Germany's strength, but Normandy opened a second wound that could never be closed. Hitler's refusal to allow strategic withdrawals only worsened the disaster. Entire divisions were sacrificed, while American and Allied forces grew stronger with each passing week. The contrast was stark. One side fought with dwindling resources and blind obedience. The other fought with confidence, innovation, and the full weight of an industrial superpower behind it. Decades after the war, German veterans reflected on the Americans they faced in Normandy with a mixture of respect and awe. They spoke of soldiers who seemed fearless, not because they lacked fear, but because they mastered it. They remembered American air power dominating the skies, artillery that never seemed to run out of shells, and infantry who advanced no matter the cost. Many admitted that once the Americans landed in force, there was no realistic hope of stopping them. Today, when visitors walk the beaches of Normandy, the scale of what happened there is difficult to comprehend. The sand appears peaceful, the sea calm. But beneath that quiet surface lies one of the greatest acts of courage in human history. Thousands of Americans gave their lives not for conquest, not for glory, but for freedom. They crossed an ocean, stormed fortified beaches, and faced an enemy at the height of its power. And they won. D-Day was not just a battle. It was a statement, a declaration that tyranny would not be allowed to stand, that democracy would be defended no matter the cost, and that ordinary citizens, when called upon, could rise to meet the greatest challenge the world had ever seen. It reshaped the course of the war, the fate of Europe, and the future of the modern world. This is why D-Day is remembered not only as the largest amphibious invasion in history, but as a turning point of civilization itself. It stands as proof that courage, sacrifice, and unity can overcome even the darkest forces. And it reminds us that freedom was not given freely. It was earned one step at a time on the shores of Normandy. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were no longer silent. They were covered in wrecked landing craft, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of men who would never return home. The sand was stained with blood, and the air was heavy with smoke, but the American flag was still moving forward. Those soldiers did not know how the war would end. They did not know if they would survive the night. They did not know if history would remember their names. What they knew was simple. Turning back was not an option. Freedom demanded a price, and that price was being paid in full on the shores of Europe. For the people trapped under Nazi occupation, D-Day was more than a military operation. It was the sound of hope returning. It was the moment the world realized that tyranny was not invincible, that even the strongest dictatorship could be broken by ordinary men who refused to surrender. America did not fight alone, but America led the way. American factories built the ships. American pilots filled the skies. American soldiers were the first to storm the beaches and face the fire. The road to Berlin began not in Germany, but on a narrow strip of sand in Normandy. D-Day did not just change the course of the war, it changed the course of history. Because on that day, when the world was at its darkest, America crossed the ocean, stood against evil, and proved that freedom was worth fighting for. And that is why June 6, 1944, will never be remembered as just another battle. It will always be remembered as the day America helped save Europe.